They said the little girl was crazy. They were wrong about everything. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., when the church bells from across Maple Street echoed through the quiet Ohio town, 7-year-old Lily Carter walked through the iron gates of Rosewood Cemetery with a folded, faded letter pressed tightly against her chest. She was small for her age, pale from too many sleepless nights, her blonde hair usually tied in a loose ponytail that slipped free in the wind. The gravel path stretched nearly a quarter-mile from the entrance to the far corner where her father was buried, and she walked it alone. Her sneakers crunching steadily against the stones, as if she had memorized every step. The adults in town had started whispering months ago. "She talks to the ground," one woman muttered outside the diner. "It's not healthy," said another near the gas station. They didn't see what Lily saw. They didn't hear what she heard. All they noticed was that she knelt beside the modest gray headstone that read, "Michael Carter, beloved father," and pressed her ear against the cool earth as if listening for something only she could understand. She would unfold the letter, its edges worn thin like old dollar bills passed through too many hands, and read the same lines over and over in a trembling voice, her words carried by the Midwestern wind across the rows of silent markers. Some days she cried quietly. Other days she just listened. The groundskeeper tried once to guide her away, gently telling her children shouldn't spend so much time in cemeteries. Lily looked up at him with eyes far older than 7 and whispered, "Daddy says they lied." And that was when the rumors began to grow roots deeper than any grave in Rosewood Cemetery. By the time the sun climbed above the tall oak trees lining Rosewood Cemetery, most people in town had already decided what kind of story Lily Carter belonged to. They preferred simple explanations. Children imagined things. Grief made people unstable. Tragedy needed a clean ending so everyone else could sleep at night. Michael Carter had worked maintenance at the industrial warehouse just off Route 17, a gray concrete building that sat 2 miles outside town near the railroad tracks. The official statement said there had been an equipment malfunction late one Friday evening. It was described as an unfortunate accident, quick and unavoidable. The company covered the funeral costs. The local paper printed a short column offering condolences. Within a week, life in Maple Hollow returned to normal. Except for Lily. She remembered how her father used to lift her onto his shoulders so she could reach the lowest apple branches in their backyard. She remembered how he checked the locks twice every night and left the hallway light on because she was afraid of the dark. Most of all, she remembered the night before he died, when he sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, writing something carefully on a single sheet of paper. His hands had trembled slightly. He folded the letter and pressed it into her palm, telling her to keep it safe, no matter what anyone said. Lily did not understand why her mother had packed 2 suitcases 3 days later and left town without saying goodbye. She did not understand why adults stopped meeting her eyes at the grocery store. But she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Her father had promised her that the truth would not stay buried forever. Autumn settled over Maple Hollow in quiet layers of gold and rust, and still Lily Carter returned to the same patch of earth every single day. The air grew colder, dipping into the low 40s by late afternoon, but she did not seem to notice. She would sit cross-legged beside the headstone, her small coat buttoned unevenly, the faded letter resting against her knees, as if it were something alive. Children from her elementary school began to whisper when they saw her walking alone past the playground. Some laughed. Some avoided her entirely. One afternoon, 2 older boys rode their bicycles past the cemetery fence and shouted that ghosts were not real. Lily did not shout back. She simply pressed her hand against the soil and closed her eyes. What she felt was not fear. It was certainty. She remembered the last look her father gave her the night he handed over the letter. It was not the look of a man defeated. It was the look of someone who believed in something bigger than himself. Inside the envelope were only a few sentences written in careful block letters, but one line stood out in her mind like a lighthouse in a storm. If anything happens to me, trust what you hear, not what they tell you. Lily did not fully understand the weight of those words, but she carried them like a promise. On a gray Tuesday morning, as clouds hung low and heavy over the cemetery, she leaned closer to the ground than ever before. For a brief second, beneath the distant hum of traffic from Route 17, she thought she heard something faint and hollow, like a knock buried deep below. And this time she was not the only one nearby. Daniel Whitmore had not planned to stop in Maple Hollow that morning. His driver was supposed to take the interstate straight through to Columbus, where a 9-figure redevelopment project waited for his signature. But a last-minute call rerouted him toward the industrial property off Route 17, the same gray warehouse that had quietly changed ownership twice in 5 years. Daniel preferred to inspect investments himself. He believed numbers told one story, but land told another. At 42, with tailored suits and a reputation built from turning failing companies into profitable empires, he was known for instinct. He noticed what others ignored. The black sedan rolled slowly past Rosewood Cemetery as he reviewed documents on his tablet, but something outside the window drew his eyes away from spreadsheets and projections. A small figure in a pale blue coat knelt beside a headstone near the far fence line. The wind lifted her hair as she pressed her ear against the ground. Daniel frowned slightly and motioned for the driver to slow down. He told himself it was simple curiosity. Yet as the car idled along the curb, he felt a strange weight settle in his chest. The child did not move when the vehicle stopped. She remained still, listening as though waiting for an answer that refused to come. Daniel stepped out the cold air cutting through his coat and walked about 20 yards toward the iron gate. He did not intend to intrude. He only wanted a closer look to confirm that what he had seen was real. Just as he reached the gate, the girl whispered something too soft to fully hear. At that exact moment, beneath the steady hum of distant highway traffic, Daniel caught a faint metallic echo rising from somewhere below the soil. It was brief, almost imagined, but it was enough to make him pause. And for the first time in years, a deal worth millions of dollars no longer felt like the most important thing in front of him. Daniel remained by the iron gate longer than he intended, his polished shoes resting against damp gravel as he studied the small figure by the headstone. He had spent 2 decades building an empire by reading people in seconds, yet this child was unreadable. She did not fidget. She did not glance around to see who was watching. She simply listened as though the earth itself held a conversation she refused to abandon. After a moment, he stepped inside the cemetery, walking slowly, so his footsteps would not startle her. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. When he was about 10 feet away, the girl finally looked up. Her eyes were clear and steady, not wild, not confused, just tired in a way that did not belong on a 7-year-old face. Daniel offered a careful nod, the same restrained courtesy he used in boardrooms. "Are you here with someone?" he asked gently. She shook her head once. "I come every day," she replied. Her voice was soft but certain. Daniel glanced at the headstone and read the name Michael Carter. Something about it tugged faintly at his memory, like a file misfiled in the back of a cabinet. "Why do you listen to the ground?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The girl unfolded the worn letter in her hands, as if the paper itself gave her courage. "Because he told me to trust what I hear," she said. Daniel felt the same faint metallic vibration again, subtle and distant, barely noticeable beneath the rustle of trees. It could have been pipes. It could have been nothing. Yet it did not feel like nothing. He crouched slightly, lowering himself closer to her level, ignoring the chill seeping through his tailored coat. For the first time that morning, Daniel Whitmore was not thinking about investments or contracts. He was thinking about a child who believed something was still speaking from beneath the soil, and about why that belief unsettled him more than it should. Daniel stayed crouched beside Lily longer than was comfortable, the cold from the late October air seeping through the fabric of his coat and into his bones. He told himself this was curiosity, nothing more. Yet the faint metallic resonance he had heard moments earlier continued to echo in his thoughts. It had not sounded like imagination. It had sounded contained, deliberate, as if something solid rested beneath the soil where nothing solid should be. He shifted his weight and placed his palm lightly against the ground a few inches from the headstone. The earth was firm, recently settled, but not freshly disturbed. He waited. At first there was only wind moving through the cemetery trees and the distant hum of a semi-truck traveling along Route 17. Then, almost imperceptible, a muted vibration brushed against his fingertips. It lasted no more than a second. Lily watched him carefully, not with excitement, but with quiet confirmation. "You heard it," she said. It was not a question. Daniel exhaled slowly and stood back up, scanning the surrounding graves as if someone might be watching. The rational part of his mind searched for explanations. Underground irrigation pipes, shifting temperature against metal, construction equipment miles away. But Rosewood Cemetery was old. There were no active systems beneath this far corner. He looked again at the name Michael Carter carved into stone. The industrial property on Route 17 resurfaced in his memory. He had reviewed acquisition documents for that warehouse years ago, when his firm absorbed a struggling logistics company tied to several subcontractors. He had not paid attention to individual employee records. Why would he have? Yet something about this felt connected in a way he could not immediately define. Lily carefully folded the letter and tucked it back inside her coat pocket. "They said it was an accident," she whispered, staring at the ground. "But Daddy told me accidents do not need secrets." Daniel felt a subtle tightening in his chest at the word secrets. He checked his watch. His driver would be waiting. A multi-million-dollar negotiation was scheduled in less than 2 hours. And yet, as he looked down at the small, determined figure beside the grave, he understood that walking away now would mean ignoring something he had already begun to question. For the first time in many years, uncertainty felt heavier than opportunity. Daniel did not leave for Columbus that morning. Instead, he told his driver to circle back in an hour and walked the remaining distance to the industrial warehouse off Route 17 alone. The building stood silent beneath a low gray sky. Its wide loading docks sealed its faded company logo, barely visible above the entrance. A chain-link fence wrapped around the property, and beyond it stretched acres of cracked asphalt and idle equipment. Daniel studied the structure with a sharper eye, now no longer as an investor evaluating square footage, but as a man searching for context. Michael Carter had worked here for nearly 11 years, according to the brief employee summary Daniel pulled up on his phone. Maintenance technician, reliable attendance, no disciplinary record. The official report from the incident described a late-evening mechanical failure during routine inspection. Clean language, minimal detail. Daniel had read hundreds of such summaries in his career. He had never questioned them. Inside the building, the air carried the scent of oil and dust. A temporary property manager recognized Daniel immediately and hurried to greet him, offering reassurances about upcoming renovations and cost projections. Daniel nodded politely, but asked instead about the employee who had died the previous year. The manager shifted uncomfortably, explaining that it had been an unfortunate event and that all matters were handled internally. Handled internally. The phrase lingered. Daniel requested access to maintenance logs from that month. The manager hesitated before retrieving a box of archived paperwork stored in a side office. As Daniel flipped through dated inspection sheets, he noticed several pages missing from the week leading up to the incident. Entire days unaccounted for. His jaw tightened slightly. Back at Rosewood Cemetery, Lily knelt once more beside the grave, unaware that a quiet chain of questions had begun moving beyond the town limits. Beneath her small hand, pressed against the soil, the faint metallic echo returned, softer this time, but steady, like a reminder that something buried does not disappear simply because paperwork says it should. That evening, Daniel returned to Rosewood Cemetery just before sunset this time, without his driver and without a schedule pressing against his wristwatch. The sky burned orange along the horizon, casting long shadows between the headstones. Lily was there again, exactly where he expected her to be, knees tucked beneath her palms, resting against the soil, as if steadying herself against something only she could feel. When she noticed him approaching, she did not look surprised. It was as if she had known he would come back. Daniel carried a small flashlight in his coat pocket and a pair of work gloves he had purchased from a hardware store on Main Street an hour earlier. He crouched beside her and listened carefully. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustling leaves and the distant bark of a dog somewhere beyond the trees. Then it came again. A faint metallic tap from below, not random, not shifting like loose debris, but contained and hollow, as though something solid rested beneath a shallow layer of earth. Daniel felt a steady pulse of focus replace his earlier uncertainty. He turned the flashlight on and examined the ground around the headstone. The soil appeared slightly more compact along one side, forming a subtle rectangular outline that did not match the natural settling pattern of older graves. He measured the space, visually estimating roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, positioned about 18 inches from the base of the marker. "Has anyone ever dug here?" he asked quietly. Lily shook her head. "Daddy told me it was safe," she whispered. Daniel's mind moved quickly through legal implications and practical risks. Disturbing cemetery property without authorization could bring consequences, but ignoring what he had already heard felt heavier. He pressed his gloved hand gently against the compacted patch and felt the vibration once more clearer now in the stillness of dusk. Whatever lay beneath that soil was not imagination, and whatever Michael Carter had tried to protect had not been buried deeply enough to stay silent forever. Daniel stood in the fading light, with the weight of a decision pressing against his ribs. The cemetery rules were clearly posted near the entrance. No unauthorized digging, no disturbance of graves. Respect the grounds. He had built his reputation by respecting boundaries and navigating within the lines of the law. Yet this did not feel like vandalism. It felt like interruption. As darkness settled over Rosewood Cemetery, the last streaks of orange disappeared and the temperature dropped into the low 40s. Lily wrapped her arms around herself but did not step away. "He said if nobody listened, I should keep listening," she murmured. Daniel studied the compacted rectangle of soil again, estimating depth and resistance. He returned to his car parked along Maple Street and retrieved a small folding shovel from the emergency kit in his trunk. It was not ideal, but it would be enough to test what lay beneath the surface. He walked back through the iron gate, his footsteps deliberate, aware that a single porch light from a nearby house overlooked the cemetery hill. He knelt beside the marked area and began to dig carefully, lifting thin layers of soil, no more than 2 inches at a time, and placing them neatly to the side. The earth was firmer than expected, as though it had been intentionally packed. After digging approximately 10 inches down, the shovel struck something solid with a dull metallic knock. Both he and Lily froze. The sound was unmistakable now. Not imagined. Not distant. Daniel brushed away the remaining dirt with his gloved hands, revealing the edge of a flat metal surface. It appeared to be a small steel box, roughly the size of a briefcase, positioned horizontally and sealed tight. No markings. No labels. Just cold metal resting beneath the grave of a man declared gone and forgotten. Daniel's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the realization that this was no coincidence. Someone had placed this deliberately. Someone had trusted that it would remain undiscovered. He tested the edges and found it was secured with a heavy latch, resistant, but not immovable. He looked at Lily, whose eyes reflected the dim beam of the flashlight with steady resolve. "Is that what he wanted you to find?" Daniel asked quietly. Lily nodded once. In the distance, headlights briefly swept across the cemetery fence as a car passed on Maple Street, illuminating the 2 figures kneeling in the dirt beside the headstone. Daniel slid his fingers beneath the latch and applied steady pressure. The metal resisted for a moment longer, then shifted with a sharp click that echoed through the still night air. The latch released with a sharp metallic snap that seemed far louder than it should have in the stillness of the cemetery. Daniel paused, scanning the dark tree line and the quiet houses beyond Maple Street, but no lights flicked on and no voices called out. He lifted the heavy lid slowly, the hinges creaking as if protesting years of silence. Inside the steel box lay a sealed waterproof bag containing a portable hard drive, several folded documents protected in plastic sleeves, and a small digital voice recorder. Everything was carefully arranged, deliberate, preserved. Lily leaned closer but did not touch anything. Daniel removed the bag and brushed off loose soil, his hands steady despite the sudden acceleration of his thoughts. He opened one of the plastic sleeves and unfolded the first document beneath the narrow beam of his flashlight. It was a series of internal maintenance reports from the warehouse on Route 17, but these were not the sanitized versions he had reviewed earlier that day. These pages detailed repeated safety complaints, flagged equipment malfunctions, and handwritten notes, warning of accounting discrepancies tied to insurance claims. At the bottom of several pages was a signature: Michael Carter. Daniel felt a cold clarity settle in. The missing maintenance logs were not accidental. They had been removed. He picked up the voice recorder and turned it over in his hand, hesitating only a moment before pressing play. A faint static crackled, followed by the unmistakable voice of a man speaking carefully and calmly. Michael explained that he had discovered inflated repair invoices and falsified inspection approvals. He stated that he feared retaliation if he reported the findings through official channels. He said he had documented everything and hidden copies where they would eventually be found. Daniel's jaw tightened as the recording continued, detailing how certain supervisors had pressured employees to sign off on incomplete repairs to secure larger insurance reimbursements. This was not a minor oversight. This was calculated fraud, and the warehouse where it occurred had later been acquired through a chain of subsidiaries that ultimately led back to Daniel's investment portfolio. The connection was indirect, buried under layers of corporate restructuring, but it was there. Lily watched him closely, her small hands clasped together as if bracing for confirmation. Daniel lowered the recorder slowly, the weight of realization pressing heavier than any business loss he had ever faced. What lay inside that box was not just evidence. It was proof that the truth had been silenced, and that he unknowingly had stepped into the aftermath of it. Daniel closed the lid of the steel box slowly, not to hide what he had found, but to steady the storm rising inside him. The faint beam of the flashlight trembled slightly in his hand as he looked down at the documents again, tracing the dates with a businessman's instinct for timelines. The fraudulent repair invoices matched quarters in which the warehouse had reported unexpected profit spikes before its acquisition. Those spikes had made the property attractive enough for one of Daniel's subsidiary firms to absorb it without asking deeper questions. He had not signed those individual approvals, but his company had benefited from the inflated valuation that followed. The realization was not dramatic. It was quiet, precise, like a ledger balancing itself in the dark. Lily watched him carefully. "He said someone important would have to listen," she whispered. Daniel met her gaze, and for the first time since stepping into the cemetery, he felt the weight of responsibility settle fully onto his shoulders. He had built a career on identifying opportunity. Now he was staring at accountability. He looked back at the voice recorder and pressed play again, listening to Michael's calm explanation of how he had tried to raise concerns internally and how he had been warned to stop asking questions. There were no threats in the recording, no raised voices, just a steady awareness that truth was inconvenient. Daniel understood that tone. He had heard it before in boardrooms when smaller partners were told to trust the process. He felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with cold weather. If this evidence surfaced publicly, it would not only reopen a closed case in Maple Hollow, it would ripple upward into corporate structures that carried his name, Investors would question him. Media would investigate. The safe path would be to hand the box quietly to a legal team and distance himself from the discovery. The safer path would be to pretend he had never stopped at the cemetery at all. He looked at the small girl kneeling beside her father's grave, clutching a faded letter as if it were oxygen. She had been called unstable for hearing what others refused to hear. Daniel inhaled slowly, the night air sharp in his lungs. Success had given him power. Power demanded choice. And for the first time in many years, he understood that protecting his empire might cost him something far greater than money. The night air grew colder as Daniel sealed the contents back inside the waterproof bag, but he did not return the steel box to the ground. Instead, he carefully lifted it free from the shallow, grave-sized cavity and set it beside him, brushing dirt from its edges with deliberate movements. Lily watched in silence, her small frame steady despite the weight of what was unfolding. Daniel knew that once this left the cemetery, there would be no quiet resolution. The documents outlined falsified maintenance approvals, inflated repair costs, and manipulated insurance filings. The voice recording established intent. None of it pointed directly to him, yet the acquisition trail led close enough to his firm that distance would not shield him from scrutiny. He imagined the headlines: investor panic, board meetings stretching past midnight, advisors urging caution, lawyers recommending containment. The easier decision would be to protect the structure he had spent 20 years building. But as he looked at Michael Carter's name carved into stone, he understood that the structure had unknowingly stood on compromised ground. Lily slowly unfolded her letter again and held it out to him for the first time. The paper was thin from being handled every day. In careful handwriting, one sentence stood apart from the rest. "If you ever feel alone, remember that truth is louder than fear." Daniel read it twice. He realized then that Michael had not hidden the evidence only to protect himself. He had hidden it to protect his daughter from doubt. Daniel turned off the flashlight and allowed the moonlight to settle over the cemetery. He made a quiet decision that felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. He would not bury this again. He would not allow it to be negotiated into silence. He looked at Lily and spoke clearly without hesitation. "Your father told the truth," he said, "and I am going to make sure the right people hear it." Lily's eyes filled with relief, not excitement, not celebration, but relief that someone else had finally listened. In that moment, Daniel understood that this was no longer about a property deal or a corporate liability. It was about restoring something that had been dismissed too easily. He picked up the steel box and held it firmly, aware that by carrying it beyond the cemetery gates, he was stepping into a confrontation that would test not only his reputation, but the integrity he believed he possessed. Daniel did not sleep that night. He placed the steel box on the long glass table inside his hotel suite in Columbus and spread the documents across the surface beneath bright overhead lights. Outside the 22nd floor window, the city moved in distant streaks of white and red headlights, unaware that a quiet storm was gathering above it. He replayed Michael Carter's recording again and again, analyzing every word the way he would dissect a merger agreement. The calm tone, the specific dates, the mention of supervisors approving incomplete repairs to inflate insurance reimbursements. There was no exaggeration, only facts. Daniel opened his laptop and began tracing the acquisition chain that connected the Route 17 warehouse to his primary holding company. 3 layers of subsidiaries, 2 silent partners, 1 executive oversight committee that had signed off on valuation adjustments based on reported quarterly gains. Gains built on falsified documentation. His chest tightened as he recognized the signature of a senior executive he had trusted for years. Someone who had assured him the numbers were clean. Someone who had sat across from him in polished conference rooms and spoken confidently about growth. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of realization pressed down harder than any financial loss ever had. This was not an isolated manipulation. It was a coordinated effort to boost asset value before sale. If exposed, it would not only implicate individuals at the warehouse level. It would reach into corporate leadership. It would reach into his board. His phone vibrated on the table, displaying a message from his chief legal advisor reminding him about the morning meeting with investors. Daniel ignored it. Instead, he opened the hard drive from the box and connected it to his computer. Folders appeared on the screen labeled Audit Copies and Personal Backup. Inside were scanned invoices, email threads, and photographs documenting equipment conditions that contradicted official inspection approvals. The evidence was overwhelming. He felt anger rise, not explosive but steady and focused. Anger at deception. Anger at complacency. Anger at himself for never looking closer. He thought of Lily kneeling in cold dirt, listening to the ground because no adult would listen to her. He thought of a man who had risked everything to preserve the truth for his daughter. Daniel closed his laptop slowly and made a decision that would fracture alliances and invite scrutiny. He would call federal investigators before sunrise. He would disclose everything. And when the consequences arrived, he would face them standing, not hiding behind silence. By sunrise, Daniel was seated in a federal office building in downtown Columbus, the steel box resting on the conference table between him and two investigators from the Financial Crimes Division. The fluorescent lights above cast a sterile glow across the documents as he methodically explained how the warehouse acquisition connected back to his corporate structure. He did not deflect. He did not minimize. He laid out the chain of ownership, the quarterly valuation spikes, the executive approvals. When he pressed play on Michael Carter's recording, the room fell silent, except for the steady voice of a man who had known he might not be believed in his lifetime. One of the investigators leaned forward, asking precise questions about dates and board communications. Daniel answered each one without hesitation. He understood that transparency would not shield him from consequences, but concealment would destroy any remaining integrity. By mid-morning, his phone was flooded with calls from executives who had already heard that federal agents were requesting internal audits. His chief financial officer demanded to know why outside authorities were involved. A senior partner warned him that public disclosure could trigger investor withdrawal. Daniel listened calmly and responded with the same sentence each time. "We are correcting something that should never have happened." Back in Maple Hollow, news traveled quickly. A black sedan with government plates parked outside the Route 17 warehouse before noon, drawing the attention of local employees who had believed the past was settled. Records were secured. Digital files were copied. Supervisors were asked to remain available for interviews. Lily sat on the front steps of her small rented house, unaware of the legal terminology unfolding miles away, but sensing a shift in the air. For the first time in months, no one drove past Rosewood Cemetery calling her strange. That afternoon, Daniel returned to Maple Hollow not as an investor, but as a witness. He met with the town sheriff and presented the evidence formally requesting the reopening of Michael Carter's case. The sheriff reviewed the documents slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to quiet gravity. "If this is accurate," he said, "then this town was told the wrong story." Daniel nodded. "Then it is time to tell the right one." Outside clouds gathered low over the cemetery hill, but beneath that gray sky, something long buried had begun to surface, and it was no longer whispering. It was demanding to be heard. The confrontation came 3 days later inside the largest conference room at Daniel's headquarters in Columbus, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling windows and polished oak walls that had witnessed years of confident decisions. This time the air felt different, heavy, charged. Seated across from him were senior executives, legal counsel, and 2 federal investigators observing quietly from the side. Printed copies of the maintenance reports and insurance filings lay spread across the long table like evidence in a courtroom. Daniel stood at the head of the room, not hiding behind a presentation screen, not deflecting responsibility. He spoke clearly, outlining how inflated repair invoices had artificially boosted quarterly profits at the Route 17 warehouse before its acquisition. He identified the internal approvals that had allowed falsified inspections to pass through compliance. When he named the executive who had signed off on the adjusted valuations, the room shifted. The man denied knowledge, at first claiming oversight errors and administrative confusion. Daniel did not raise his voice. He pressed play on the recording of Michael Carter once more, letting the steady words fill the space between them. The explanation of manipulated reports, the documentation of warnings, ignored the careful note that he feared retaliation for speaking up. Silence followed. The denial faltered. Paper trails do not disappear when examined under direct light. By afternoon, federal investigators requested formal statements from multiple executives. Emergency board votes were called. Trading on several related assets was temporarily halted pending review. News outlets began reporting that a major corporate investigation had been initiated following voluntary disclosure by its own founder. Daniel understood that his company's valuation would drop. Lawsuits might follow. Partnerships could dissolve. But as he signed the official affidavit detailing everything he knew, he felt an unexpected steadiness settle inside him. That evening, he drove back to Maple Hollow and walked once more to Rosewood Cemetery. Lily was there, as always, kneeling beside the headstone. He approached quietly and told her that her father's voice had been heard in rooms where powerful decisions were made. He told her the truth was now in the hands of people whose job was to protect it. Lily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for doubt. She found none. For the first time since Michael Carter's name had been carved into stone, the silence around that grave no longer felt like defeat. It felt like the beginning of accountability. Within weeks, the investigation expanded beyond Maple Hollow and Columbus, reaching regulatory agencies and insurance auditors across state lines. Subpoenas were issued. Financial records were reconstructed line by line. Executives who once spoke with polished certainty now answered measured questions under oath. The warehouse on Route 17 remained closed as inspectors reviewed maintenance histories that had long been ignored. What had once been dismissed as a single unfortunate incident was formally reclassified as a case influenced by corporate misconduct and falsified reporting. In Maple Hollow, the shift was quieter, but just as profound. The town newspaper printed a front-page correction acknowledging that new evidence had emerged regarding Michael Carter's death. Neighbors who had once avoided Lily now lowered their eyes in passing, their earlier whispers replaced with uneasy silence. The word accident no longer carried authority. One afternoon, the county prosecutor announced that charges related to insurance fraud and document manipulation were being filed against multiple former supervisors and executives connected to the warehouse operations. The announcement did not bring celebration. It brought gravity. Daniel attended the hearing in a simple dark suit, not seated among executives, but beside investigators as a cooperating witness. He answered questions about acquisition procedures, compliance gaps, and the moment he chose disclosure over concealment. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, microphones raised, asking whether he regretted exposing vulnerabilities within his own company. Daniel replied calmly that integrity is not a vulnerability. It is a foundation. Back in Maple Hollow, a social worker visited Lily's home to reassess her living situation after learning that her mother had left months earlier without stable contact information. Daniel quietly offered to fund temporary guardianship support, ensuring Lily would not be placed into an unfamiliar system while extended family was located. He did not publicize the gesture. He did not attach his name to it. One crisp morning, as sunlight filtered through thinning autumn trees, Daniel stood once more at Rosewood Cemetery beside Lily. The soil had been carefully restored where the steel box once rested. Lily no longer pressed her ear against the ground. Instead, she stood upright, holding her father's letter in both hands. The town had begun to understand that she had never been hearing ghosts. She had been hearing truth, waiting for courage. And now that courage had reshaped not only a corporation, but a community that had once chosen silence over listening. Winter arrived early in Maple Hollow, covering the cemetery in a thin sheet of frost that shimmered under the pale morning sun. The investigation had moved into formal proceedings with federal filings detailing counts of insurance fraud, falsified safety certifications, and coordinated financial misrepresentation. Several former executives negotiated plea agreements, while others prepared for trial. For Daniel, the consequences were both public and personal. His company's stock value dropped nearly 30% within a month. Longtime partners withdrew. News commentators debated whether he was reckless for exposing internal corruption or courageous for refusing to conceal it. Daniel accepted the losses without protest. He had restructured leadership, implemented independent compliance oversight, and personally funded restitution programs for affected workers at the Route 17 facility. He visited Maple Hollow weekly, no longer arriving in a chauffeured sedan, but driving himself along the two-lane highway that cut through frozen fields. Lily's guardianship hearing concluded in early December, with the court granting temporary custody to a distant aunt who lived 30 miles away while long-term arrangements were reviewed. Daniel attended quietly seated in the back row. When the judge acknowledged that new evidence had restored Michael Carter's professional record and cleared his name of negligence, a subtle shift moved through the courtroom. Lily squeezed the letter in her hands and looked up at Daniel across the aisle. He offered a small nod, not triumphant, but steady. Later that afternoon, they stood together at Rosewood Cemetery, their breath visible in the cold air. Lily no longer knelt to listen to the ground. Instead, she spoke aloud about school, about the aunt who baked cornbread on Sundays, about how the other children had stopped calling her strange. Daniel listened carefully, recognizing that healing did not arrive in dramatic waves. It arrived in quiet corrections, in headlines amended, in reputations restored, in a child who could now speak of her father without doubt clouding his memory. As snow began to fall in light drifting flakes, Daniel understood that transformation is not measured only in court verdicts or financial restructuring. It is measured in the courage to stand beside someone small and overlooked and say without hesitation that their voice matters. And in that frozen stillness beneath a sky the color of silver, the story that had begun with whispers had turned into something far stronger than rumor. It had become recognition. Spring arrived, slowly melting the last patches of snow along the edges of Rosewood Cemetery and softening the hard ground that had once hidden a steel box of evidence. By March, the federal case had advanced into formal indictments, with public filings outlining years of manipulated reports and concealed financial gain. Restitution funds were established for employees whose safety complaints had been dismissed, and regulatory reforms were announced to prevent similar misconduct in the future. Daniel stood before his restructured board of directors one final time to confirm his decision to step down as chief executive officer. He would remain a shareholder, but leadership would pass to an independent management team chosen for compliance expertise rather than rapid expansion. Some investors called it unnecessary sacrifice. Daniel considered it overdue accountability. In Maple Hollow, the Route 17 warehouse was scheduled for demolition, its operations permanently halted. In its place, state officials approved plans for a vocational training center focused on mechanical safety and technical certification, funded in part by penalties recovered from the investigation. A plaque at the entrance would bear Michael Carter's name, recognizing his documented warnings that had once been ignored. On a mild April afternoon, Daniel drove to Lily's aunt's home, a modest white farmhouse 30 miles outside town, surrounded by budding trees and open fields stretching nearly half a mile in every direction. Lily ran across the yard when she saw him, her laughter light and unburdened in a way he had not heard before. She no longer carried the letter every hour of the day, though she kept it safely tucked inside a small wooden box on her bedside table. Together they visited the cemetery, now green with new grass and bright with small wildflowers. Lily placed a fresh bouquet beside the headstone and read a short note she had written herself, thanking her father for teaching her to trust what she heard. Daniel stood beside her, hands folded, understanding that justice had not erased loss, but had restored dignity. As sunlight filtered through the trees and warmed the quiet hillside, he realized that the greatest transformation had not occurred in courtrooms or boardrooms. It had occurred in the space between a child's belief and an adult's willingness to listen. And in that space, something lasting had taken root, stronger than rumor, stronger than fear, stronger even than silence. By early summer, Maple Hollow felt different in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. The air carried the scent of cut grass and fresh paint from storefronts that had begun quietly renovating their facades. Conversations at the diner no longer dropped to whispers when Lily's name was mentioned. Instead, people spoke carefully about lessons learned and mistakes made. The vocational training center on Route 17 broke ground under a bright blue sky, and townspeople gathered in folding chairs, set up across a wide stretch of gravel. Lily sat in the front row beside her aunt, her feet barely touching the ground, a simple white ribbon tied in her hair. When the mayor announced that the center would emphasize safety education and ethical reporting practices, a soft murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Daniel stood off to the side, not at the podium, watching as Michael Carter's name was read aloud with respect rather than suspicion. Lily squeezed the small wooden box she had brought with her, the one that now held her father's letter. She no longer needed to press her ear to the soil to feel close to him. His voice had traveled far beyond that hillside. After the ceremony, children ran across the open field measuring nearly half an acre, their laughter echoing under the open sky. Lily joined them without hesitation. Daniel remained where he was for a moment, taking in the sound. Success had once meant numbers on a quarterly report and expansion across state lines. Now it felt like something quieter, a restored name, a town that had chosen accountability, a child who no longer carried the weight of being dismissed. And as the sun lowered over Maple Hollow, casting long, golden shadows across the field, Daniel understood that some investments do not return profit. They return dignity. On a warm July evening, Daniel walked alone through Rosewood Cemetery, the grass now thick and green beneath his shoes and fireflies blinking softly along the tree line. He paused in front of Michael Carter's headstone, noticing how the stone looked different in summer light, less like a marker of tragedy and more like a testament. The soil had fully settled where the steel box once rested, leaving no visible trace of what had been hidden there. Yet Daniel knew that what had surfaced from beneath that ground had reshaped more than one life. He thought about the months behind him, about stepping down from leadership, about facing shareholders who measured worth in percentages rather than principles. He had lost contracts, prestige, and a portion of his fortune, but standing there in the quiet glow of dusk, he felt no regret. Lily arrived a few minutes later with her aunt carrying a small jar of wildflowers picked from the edge of a nearby field. She placed them carefully beside the headstone and read aloud a short entry from her summer journal describing how she wanted to become an engineer one day so she could make sure machines were always safe. Her voice was steady, filled with possibility instead of sorrow. Daniel listened, realizing that the most powerful outcome of all had not been court rulings or public apologies. It had been this shift from fear to future. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned deep shades of orange and violet, Lily looked up and smiled, not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer defined her. Daniel returned the smile gently. In the stillness of that summer evening beneath a sky wide enough to hold both memory and hope, the story that began with doubt had become something enduring. It had become a promise kept. Years later, visitors to Maple Hollow would see the vocational training center standing where the old warehouse once cast its shadow, sunlight reflecting off wide glass windows and students moving with purpose inside. At the entrance, a bronze plaque carried Michael Carter's name, along with a simple inscription about integrity and courage. Most who passed by would not know the full story of how that plaque came to be. They would not picture a small girl kneeling in cold autumn dirt, listening to something others dismissed. They would not imagine a steel box resting beneath packed soil or the quiet decision made in a hotel room high above Columbus. But Lily would remember, on her 12th birthday, she returned to Rosewood Cemetery, alone for the first time, walking the familiar quarter-mile path with confident steps. She no longer carried the letter every day, yet she kept it carefully preserved, its paper now framed in her bedroom. Standing before her father's headstone, she spoke about her science classes, about building small mechanical projects in school, about how she wanted to design systems that protected workers rather than ignored them. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying her voice across the hillside. Daniel watched from a respectful distance near the iron gate, giving her space yet never truly far. He understood that the most meaningful chapters of this story no longer required his presence at the center. They required his continued willingness to listen. As Lily turned and walked back toward the sunlight spilling across Maple Street, her posture straight and certain, the cemetery no longer felt like a place of unanswered questions. It felt like a place where truth had been given room to breathe. And in that steady, ordinary afternoon light, the echo that once rose faintly from beneath the ground had transformed into something far stronger. It had become a legacy carried forward. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next story.